So, if the church had a job, what would our job be? We're going to think about that today on Now at Devotions from Trinity Lutheran in Cyrus. Now, of course, you can't simplify something like the church into one job. I recognize that. And the church has had a lot of roles to play at a lot of different times, and it depends on where you are and who you are and for whom you are. But today, we are in the book of Mark. It's the end of the church year. We just got 2-3 Sundays left here before Christ the King Sunday. And Jesus, our focus in the text during this time is Jesus talking about who we are to be. And this week, Jesus is speaking pretty strongly. He's preaching in the temple, like I said, Mark chapter 12, and he says, he's watching the scribes and the Pharisees, and they've been challenging him, and he's been kicking out the money changers. And then they're sitting in the temple and seeing all this fanciness and all these beautiful columns and all this wealth and all these things, and people giving all their money, giving to the offering, which is supposed to go, just like any church, the offering goes to a lot of things, but also to run the temple and to run all the other stuff too, and to make sure that God's word is being preached and that people are doing prayer, like all those things, sure. But then this widow comes in and she gives what Jesus says is the last of what she's got, and says what she gave was more than anyone else. And a lot of times we just stop there and be like, good job, widow. But if you look at the wider context, this is a condemnation of the temple. It's a big one. Why would this widow think that she should be giving the last of what she has when it's precisely to her that the temple should be giving of the wealth that they have, which is to feed the widow and the orphan, which is God's primary concern over and over for the temple? One of the things we do as the church is remind. We often remind people that God is alive, God is active, God is well. Here are the things God is caring about. And then we are to live out what those things are to help people not just hear the word, but see it lived, right? That's a big part of what we do. And Jesus uses this phrase, the Pharisees and the scribes, they devour widows' houses. And he's referring to the prophets. He's referring to Amos, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. Ezekiel, what is it, 24? Somewhere I'll put the number on the screen. But Ezekiel points out, hey, shepherds of the people of Israel, you aren't supposed to be eating the fat off the sheep and living on the wool and staying warm and pretty. You're supposed to be feeding the sheep. Yeah, sometimes, and you've seen this in, mega churches and church scandals and all this stuff, like the church loses a lot of credibility, and the temple was losing credibility too, when it doesn't live its mission. And in this section, Jesus points out, he says, hey, if the people you're supposed to care for aren't being cared for, are you, in fact, then the temple of God? If God's temple, like Ezekiel says, is a place where God will be when the widow and the orphan are taken care of, and you aren't doing that work, and more so, the work you are doing seems to be just benefiting a few people, what's going on? He asked the hard question. People today say that we're post-Christian, but in a lot of ways, we still carry a lot of those ethics. And what the church has sometimes ended up doing, rather than caring for God's people or proclaiming the message, the church lately often has become the morality police. We spend a lot of time telling people what they're doing wrong. And I gotta say, it's not always a good look, is it? Don't get me wrong. A part of the church's job is absolutely to name injustice, right? Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with God. But pretty repeatedly, Jesus points out that God is the judge, not us. And he really seems to worry about the least and the lost and the lonely. And God's message overall in the Old Testament is very consistently about treat one another well, remember my promises and my love for you, and act in this world as if that were the case. Do not worship other idols. Don't fall into the temptation of power and money. Don't fall into the temptation of being a culture that is only about sin and shame. Live for your neighbor. As a church, how are we to do our job today in the real world? And I would suggest to you that we have an example right before this in Mark. Jesus says, a scribe comes up to him, who's actually genuinely interested, which is kind of a condemnation of the wretches of the church, because a number of people did get it, and the leaders shut them down, right? But the scribe says, Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the scribe goes, that's brilliant. You just summed it all up. How did you do that? We can do that too. We can do that too. Not perfectly, but with help, with faith and hope and charity. So for Trinity Lutheran and Cyrus, now at Devotions, Pastor Chris signing off for now. Bye-bye.